Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning to everyone, and I see a lot of friendly faces out here, folks that I know, for this important discussion. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Brian Matthew. I'm a policy analyst with the Center for Local Governance here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And of course, this is the first panel discussion for today's event, the Local Government Liberty Summit. So I'm going to start by briefly saying a few words about today as a whole. And this is a fun little experiment for us where our hope is that this summit could be a forum for local leaders serving in elected office or who are working in staff at local governments or who are just citizens wanting to make a difference in their local communities to come together and learn about liberty-minded solutions that our community, to the challenges that our communities are facing. This conviction really comes out of the idea that local governments and their decisions matter. The services that they provide, the taxes that they impose, the zoning decisions that they make, all the rest have huge implications on people's actual lives and their day-to-day. And that as citizens, we have an obligation to ensure that local governments act to secure our liberties, but where they sometimes step outside of their legitimate boundaries, we have an obligation to hold them to account. And so that's the reason why we're gathering people together. That's why we want to start having this conversation. So today we're going to be hearing from various local government experts and officials, starting with this great panel that I'm about to introduce in a sec. And then we're going to move on to a keynote speech from Austin City Council member Ellen Troxclair during lunch. And then after lunch, we're going to have a couple more panels, and I hope you guys stay for the entire event. I think it's going to be a good time, because we're going to speak frankly about the challenges facing our local communities, the opportunities to advance free market principles locally, and the lessons learned during the last legislative and special sessions. And we really want to stress the collaborative and interactive nature of today. During the panels and in between sessions, we really hope that you will engage with the speakers and with the content and present your own ideas and thoughts on the issues of the day. So with all that said, let's turn now to this great panel. Our topic for this hour is tactics and strategies for effective local governance. And so our goal is to discuss tactics that individuals, be they elected officers, be they staff members, be they interested citizens, effective tactics for these individuals to employ to be able to advocate for sensible small government policies in their communities. And here at the Foundation, we share the perspective of our founding fathers that limited government depends on a number of critical factors working together. And I'm going to mention three. First, there's the basic insight that any government, left to its own devices, will try to expand its reach and authority over the people in the pursuit of its objectives. And therefore, one of the most important ways that we check government is by creating overlapping and competing layers of government to defend the people's liberty. That's why we have a strong judiciary and a legislature. That's why we have an executive. That's why we have local governments and state governments and the federal government. But second, limited government also depends upon an informed, active, and engaged citizenry. And third, limited government depends on principled leaders, folks who are in the trenches in the government, who are willing to push back against some of the totalizing tendencies of government, and at times even sacrifice their own interests in order to make policy a little better, in order to push a conservative reform through and to protect folks' liberties and pocketbooks. Thankfully, we have a good set of folks here with experience with all three of these factors in protecting local liberty, whether it's from working within government as an elected leader or staff, engaging in the judicial process, or organizing citizenry to stand up to potential local government abuses. So going down the line, I'm going to just introduce our panelists, and I'm going to start actually with the Honorable Don Zimmerman, former city council member for Austin District 6. He served as a precinct chair for the Travis County Republican Party. He was a committeeman for the Texas GOP, a delegate to the 2012 Republican National Convention, and a grassroots organizer and fundraiser for then U.S. Representative Ron Paul's 2008 presidential campaign. He also, interestingly, founded the Travis County Taxpayers Union, an organization that opposes local tax increases, and served as the treasurer of its political action committee. And he's been involved in a few campaigns fighting against some big-ticket bond packages recently in May and coming up, and I'm sure we'll get into that. To his left is John Gimbel, who serves as the district clerk for McLennan County. For the past 3 years, John has worked to trim spending and reform the county budgeting process. He served as a former statewide officer for the Young Conservatives of Texas. In 2010, he joined the Texas State Guard and served for a majority of the next year on active duty as part of Operation Border Star, increasing the state and local accountability on the impact of a porous national border. Most recently, he was activated for Hurricane Harvey, managing the Army component's 8 regiments, personnel, and accountability. Finally, I'd like to introduce Adrian Spears, who's to my left. Adrian's an attorney with Sierra and Spears PLLC with a wealth of litigation experience, particularly in representing various government entities. He has represented Laredo, San Antonio, Johnson City, Meadow Lakes, Euless, Hollywood Park, as well as the San Antonio Housing Authority, the Housing Authority of the City of Laredo, and Laredo Transit Management, Inc. He has also served as Assistant City Attorney for the cities of Alpine, Boerne, Euless, Forney, and Hondo, Texas. So again, we just have a wealth of experience here represented on the panel, and let's all just welcome them with a round of applause.
You're not really to the left of me.
So I'm going to try and get out of the way now as much as possible and allow our panelists to speak. And the goal here, again, to remind the three of you, is really to have a conversation. So please feel free to respond to one another's points or to add thoughts. Even if I direct a question to one person, feel free to jump in and add your own take on things, because I'm really here to facilitate the conversation, and then we're going to end with 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. I thought I'd start us off with a very general question that can help frame the discussion. So why don't we just go down the row, starting with Adrian, and each of you introduce yourselves to the audience and just reflect on your career so far, working on public policy, and speak a little bit about the principles that drive you in your job and what you've learned about putting those principles into action. What's been effective? What have you learned is maybe not so effective?
Yeah, well, when I first started my career, as you mentioned, I've represented a lot of governmental entities, and a lot of that was through the TML, risk pool. Now, it's kind of interesting. When you first start off, TML has a big lobby. They also have all their city attorneys trained underneath them to further their policies. And which their policies are more big government. Government can do whatever they want. You have immunities. It's hard to sue you. And in fact, when I first started litigating cases, I always won because I would argue that the cities were immune. You can't even sue them. And I thought I was just some great lawyer. Yeah, I'm like, man, I'm good. I'm winning all these cases. Well, more recently, I'm representing cities in a different capacity. I'm representing cities fighting annexation. And when you come in to fight on the other side, even though you're still representing cities, you're looking out for more liberty-minded people. And you go into court, and the first thing the city attorney would do, or the entity that's representing them, is file a plea to jurisdiction. And so you got to fight to just stay in court, just to have one day in court. So it's really hard to do. And I'm coming to learn that, and there's ways around that, but we also need a lot of help from the legislature. And one of the big problems I find is TML, if you're a city attorney, you have to join their association. Anytime you're an elected official, city council member, guess who trains you? TML. So they push their agendas, and guess who benefits from that? TML. They also use citizen funds to further their agenda. So you really don't have many options, and guess who is at risk of losing your job? You, the council member who was elected to defend liberties in the first place. And guess who's still there? TML. When TML first started and the risk pool first started, I think they had 3 adjusters. They're a huge monster. They have their hands everywhere. So with that being said, I can pass, but also I wanted to add too, and I'll talk about this later, I'm also a presiding judge now in the great city of Von Ormy, and I'm a prosecutor in Kyle, and there's a lot of issues I want to discuss with the courts, because to me, the judiciary is probably where you come into most contact with your constituents and your citizens, and you have the power to put them in jail. So there is no bigger threat on liberty than your court system, and there's ways to deal with that, and I have a lot of good ideas that we can talk about later, but I want to yield my time to these gentlemen to the left.
Sure.
Thank you. Actually, I'm not to the left. I may be to the right of them. And I think this is the first time I've been in the middle on anything. I'm usually to the far right in these accusations. I got my start, I'm Don Zimmerman. I got my start in politics from my dad. He was an Air Force veteran and a Barry Goldwater supporter. So I got started in politics 1964. I was 4 years old. And our family in Bexar County, San Antonio, we had a car with a Barry Goldwater sign on it. You know, in LBJ country. You know, Texas was all LBJ country. You remember in the 60s. Everybody thought we were crazy. So you see where I started out. So, let me just say a couple of, first I want to say thank you for those comments from Judge Spears, because he's absolutely right about the TML. And I want to add to the TML the entrenched incumbent bureaucracies. Those are also the people that seem to be always there, where the council members, elected people come and go, but the entrenched bureaucracies are there. Some of them endure for decades. And I want to say something about annexation quickly. One of the most interesting cases I was involved with on Austin Council was Old Lampasas Trail. Some of you know where that is in northwest Austin. There was a case that the city of Austin brought a hostile annexation against about 10 property owners on Old Lampasas Trail. It's one of those pockets that's kind of inside the city of Austin, surrounded by the Austin boundaries. And to make a long story short, we were alerted to this, and I met with the neighbors. They're just to the southern edge of District 6, which I represented, and I said, now, I want to tell you, to my knowledge, no annexation has ever been defeated in the history of the city of Austin. So you're defending the Alamo. You know, the odds are against you. I said, but here's the good part. If you lose, you don't take a bayonet to the gut. So why not fight them, you know, with everything you've got? And they did. And the angle we took on that was the potential flooding issues of the upper Bull Creek, because they just happened to have the Bull Creek in their backyard. But again, strategically, you should also always find an angle when you're trying to do something in local government. That appeared to be the best angle, and we worked it really hard. To their credit, those property owners showed up. They lobbied council members. I stayed in the background because I'm just one member and I'm outgunned by the other council members. So they worked it hard. They showed up at all the presentations. I had a conversation with the mayor. I said, Mr. Mayor, you know, our form of representative government is based on the consent of the governed. All of these property owners are opposed. That's got to make a difference. Didn't make a difference. When we were sitting in front of the bureaucrats there, the lead bureaucrat for annexation, I asked him on the record there, I said, after he explained the annexation criteria, a long criteria, right, for annexation. So I said, Mr. Guernsey, where does consent of the governed fall within that criteria of annexation? Of course, it doesn't exist. Can you imagine the criteria for annexation does not include the will of the property owners? That's how bad things have gotten. But we were able to beat that by a vote of 7-4 against the mayor's coalition. And that was the first time in the history of Austin that an annexation had been defeated. It's remarkable. But let me just say quickly before I pass it on, my opinion about local governance and your effectiveness, you have to be somewhat visible. You have to invest some time and money. Get involved in electoral campaigns. Because if these bureaucrats know who you are, you can instill some fear and respect. But if you're quiet, if you're passive, if you're silent, if you're never involved and you never donate money, you don't matter. And they don't respect you whatsoever. So that's my opinion on the matter. And again, thanks for having me here.
Sure. Well, just got recently elected. It still feels recent, 2014, to a countywide office, and you can tell I'm a little bit younger than most elected officials at the county level. And course, they like to throw the kitchen sink at you. And so the first decision I had to face was whether I was really going to run and want to make this a public thing. And one of the things in Young Conservative Texas that we've always said is government is made of those who show up. And so the first decision is whether you're going to participate personally as a candidate and then eventually an elected official, or you want to help someone else that you agree with. But if you don't do either of those, you're going to get people that you don't agree with. So that's the first kind of thing I would put out there. I'm essentially an elected bureaucrat, and the only thing worse than that is an unelected bureaucrat. So the people get to retain me or not every 4 years. In county government is made up of what are very similar elected bureaucrats. You do have JPs, constables, but they don't have a day-to-day interaction. The JPs will get traffic tickets from DPS or their region. I get to handle all the jury service and the paper shuffling for the courts, which is now digital, so it's even harder to get a paper cut. But we have county clerks and other election administrators, so a lot of your government is not chosen by you, but you get to choose people that choose people. And so it's still important because you can get not just an ideological mind shift, but getting a fresh set of eyes in there. We've done a lot of process changes in the last 3 years, and we've been able to add a court to our system that's a state-administered CPS court. Normally when you add another judge, you're adding 3 to 5 clerks. For the first 2 years, I left one position unfilled, and then once that court came fully online, we added that one position back to the budget. So process improvements, you don't always see them, because if you just looked at that without talking to people, you would see, well, he just stayed about the same. Well, what drove me to want to run was analyzing our county budgets for the last 10 years that my predecessor had been there, and she's the last county-wide elected Democrat, and her department that she managed grew at twice the rate of the rest of government. And so over 10 years, that adds up. And so when you have someone in office that's always demanding more in some fashion, you're going to have a positive pressure on the budget. And since I've come in for personnel and everything else, we've taken COLAs and we've done some shifting, but our budget is essentially where it was 3 years ago, within about 5% over 3 years. I think that's a pretty slow growth rate. So bending down those cost curves is a big thing. We've talked about several different areas of government. One of the biggest things I would commend our county commissioners on is working with the other local governments. We pass through interlocal agreements with our county commissioners, and that's where the county government is providing the labor, sometimes the materials, and getting paid back a portion from a small city that doesn't have a road crew. And it saves both layers of government time and energy, because you're not having to duplicate efforts and say this portion of this road project is one person and this is another, and then you suddenly have a meetup like this. So if you can manage things together and work together, our state government was designed for people that want to work together. But we often get into, we saw in the legislative session this last time, our legislators saying we're going to control the local governments. That's a narrative that I heard Texas Tribune pass on, and a lot of it was liberty-minded controls. But then at the local level, I hear a lot of my peers say, we're getting all these unfunded mandates. So I kind of jab them behind the scenes and say, well, are you looking for a handout? I mean, most mandates and laws, I exist because of an unfunded mandate. My job is paid for by the county to provide the clerk services for 5 district courts and 2 unelected Austin courts that serve our county. That's an unfunded mandate. The county has to pay me a salary and provide me a staff. It's in state law. Much of our government is an unfunded mandate, but at the same time, the county government has the tax controls, and they get to set where the budget process goes. So,
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think a common thread I'm picking up from all 3 of you, though you're coming from, all coming from a common conservative sort of core, you're acting in different areas of government, right? And as Don mentioned, sometimes you attract the attention or run into the opposition of entrenched interests, be they from the bureaucrats or from prosecutors and judges, or even just county staff. And so when you run into that opposition, what is your strategy for dealing with it and for continuing to make progress on the conservative reform you're pushing? And let's start with John and maybe work our way back to Adrian.
Sure. So we've had a few issues with that. I usually try to keep my mouth shut and think first. I know one of our commissioners' court's kind of unspoken things behind, but listen for the first 6 months you're on there, because if you're going to interject your opinion on everything, you don't know the history of what they've been studying. And so before I come out publicly on anything, I usually try to do my homework, and that usually helps out. One of the issues that we've been interplaying with is the Supreme Court of Texas. The state legislature has given them broad rulemaking authority, and they've taken that to, as long as it doesn't conflict substantially with state law, they can rewrite state law. And so I got a mandate last year for the civil side and this year for the criminal side that someone can claim they're indigent, get free court costs, or have them waived, depending on how you want to look at it. And I'm not legally allowed to hold up their case until I used to be legally allowed to review it, and they couldn't finalize the case. Now, we have to have it finalized before the case is finalized, and they can go ahead and get out of the court costs without me holding it up. We have 1 or 2 clerks in the state that wouldn't let them file it until it was reviewed. And so the Supreme Court came and rewrote the rules for the whole system based off that one problem for access to justice. The biggest access to justice problem is good attorneys. They're expensive. Court costs are $278 before you get to service. It hadn't changed since the 90s. So it's kind of so you're having to work through processes to mutate so that you can live under these new sets of rules that have been handed down. We still review every single filing and indigency matter, and we still find about 80% of them aren't indigent and talk them into paying for their court costs. So that's...
Well, it's a great question. In my view, the incumbent bureaucracies have a bizarre culture of abusing power. Lord Acton famously said, "Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." And the latter generally describes career bureaucrats that are highly entrenched. And I'll give you a simple example that shows you just how astonishing this culture is. When I first got elected to council, I'd made a promise to my voters, because we're out in far northwest Austin, that I would open a local office to do constituent service. Okay, we're 45 minutes away up in Avery Ranch and some of these locations. So we made that promise in the campaign. It was well received, and I got elected. So I'm going to fulfill this campaign promise. So very, very early on, I pick up the phone and I call the appropriate bureaucracies in the city. There's dozens of them. And I said, "We're going to open an office." And they said, "Well, we don't think you have the legal authority to decide that you're going to open a local constituent service office." And I said, "I'm sorry, what gives you the legal authority to say I don't have the legal authority to fulfill a campaign promise and open a constituent service office?" So that started this merry-go-round. And I guess it's my style as a bull in the china shop, I suppose, but I said, "We're going to open the office." And they're kind of like, and then the next thing they said is, "Well, you can't open an office until we do, the real estate department does a survey, a market survey of commercial real estate in your area. And that'll take about a year." I said, "Well, actually, no. What we're going to do is we're going to open an office." I was using it for my campaign office. It's only $500 a month. It's a great deal. I've lived in this area 17 years myself. I kind of know what real estate's going for, and this is what we're going to do. So they said, "Well, no, you can't do that. Your contract's going to have to be reviewed by the legal department." So just for grins, I sent them a sample of the contract. And the lawyers there, of course, they took a couple of weeks, and that was with me hammering on them to get done. They would take a year if I gave it to them. So they come back and they have the contract all marked up with red ink. And I said, "This isn't going to work," but I sent it to the manager of the retail offices, and he goes, "It would cost me more to pay a lawyer to go through these red lines than I would get from you in rent in a year." And I said, "You're right. It's all a scam." So I told him, I said, "You know what? We're going to go with the standard contract that they had with a couple of minor changes." And they said, "Well, you don't have the authority to spend the money to pay for the..." I said, "Well, actually, I do. Because I've got, about a $200,000 budget. I can open the office and staff it with no change to my budget. I'm not asking for more money. We're just going to reallocate our existing fund." But they battled me. Over what? Over their exercise of power and authority over an elected representative. It's illustrative of the abuse of power and the incredible mindset that this bureaucracy has. They do it to you as well. If they're willing to do that against somebody that's been elected by the people to represent them, imagine how arrogant they are when it comes to you, a normal citizen that pays their salary. So the bottom line is I signed the agreement in spite of them, and we moved into our office after a few weeks. But yeah, why do I have to fight these government bureaucrats that are paid by you, by us, to serve you and to serve us? Their mindset is the exact opposite. They rule over you. Just like I said in the annexation case, the city's criteria for annexation doesn't even consider, it doesn't contemplate the consent of the governed. Okay, so you're up against it here. I want to encourage you to battle these people.
May I make a comment?
Please,
Is it appropriate?
please wait until the question is.
Well, I'll pass on, but yeah, thank you for the time for that
We'll get to
insight. But I want to tell you, you're up against it, but there is something you can do.
Yeah, real quick, I touched on it earlier. I was talking about how you have one entity that provides all the training. And quite simply, if you get elected or you're hired by a city, it's easier to conform. It just is. I mean, because everything runs a certain way. And I actually commend Councilmember Zimmerman for standing up for what he believes, and which is the reason he got elected. So that's really what you got to do. You just got to stand up for yourself. And it's hard. It really is. It's easier not to. Now, on a city attorney level, or a judge or a prosecutor, it's a little bit different. You are a contract, not an employee or an independent contractor. So even though the court system, for example, in a municipality, you're supposed to just do justice. You're supposed to put blinders on as far as revenue and things like that. So it's a little bit harder, but you just got to do what you believe and do what's right. You just do, and eventually it works out because you show them the proof of the good things that are happening. For example, in the court system, as a prosecutor, you get a lot of pressure from counsel to produce revenue. You know, the counsel, that's what they do. They're the counsel of a big corporation, basically, a municipal corporation. So they want to look at the bottom line, and the court is just a revenue source.
Which means collecting fees from.
Correct, fines and whatnot. Now, the problem is a prosecutor, they'll come in there with that mindset, even though nothing's said, there's just kind of the pressure you get. They always crunch the numbers, how much are you producing this month and whatnot. So if someone comes in, they have an incentive, even though it's not said, it's kind of hidden, they want to rack the fees up and the fines. The problem is that becomes uncollectible. And then you run into a problem where guess who they have to see next? Me, the judge. And once they get to my level, there's an issue. In other words, they've missed their payments. They're not doing what they said they were going to do. And then I have to make a decision of whether or not to give them another pass. And I also have the power to put them in jail if they don't do what the court says. Now, I give everybody chance after chance after chance after chance. You should not put people in jail. Even though you have that power, you should never use it. The only time that ever comes into play is if they completely blow the court off or they've missed 5 chances or 6 chances. If people come talk to me, I put them on payment plans, community service, whatever I can do, and I make it to where it's collectible. I'll cut their fines down. The city ends up collecting within 6 months. If they don't pay their fines, it goes to the collection agency, so it tacks on another $500 for that. And before you know it, they can't pay these fines. So what I do, I just make it to where things are collectible. And I do it right. And eventually the council sees that over the long run. But you have people fighting you. You have the collection agencies fighting you. How come we're not getting more collections? Well, if people are paying, you don't need to collect.
Right, and the collection agency is private interest.
Correct.
Right.
And they charge their attorney's fees. So for example, let's say someone gets a $200 speeding ticket, goes to the prosecutor. Let's say they missed their court date. Then we put a failure to appear on them, which is another $350, plus warrant fees, plus omni-based fees. I always tell my prosecutors, if they ever show up, dismiss the FTA. You don't need to do that. They're here to pay for it. People miss a court date, they didn't get the mail or whatever, but you're not going to take a $200 fine, jack it up to $700 or $800. There's no way they can pay for that. So I tell the prosecutors, get rid of the FTA. They still have to pay their omni and warrant fees, and they still have the underlying offense, which they came in there to begin with. You're going to collect. You don't need to collect $700. collected 200. If you jack it up to $700, they're not going to pay it. Who has an extra $700 lying around?
Yeah.
They're just not going to do it. And guess what? It has to come to me.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. To answer the question, I'm getting a little off topic, but it's hard to do what you know is right when you have the bureaucracy, like you said before, against you. You have the training facilities training people how to do things their way. You have the incumbents that are in there that are used to one way. You have the city attorneys who are advising these people who are getting their training from one source. So it's hard. It really is. It's a balancing act. And like I said, I commend you for what you did. It was tough to do, and it probably wasn't popular to some, but you did what you did was right.
But it felt good.
Right.
Well, just to follow up on that briefly, more for Don and John, and we can start with Don. One thing I learned, I worked briefly with the city of Houston in the legal department. One thing I learned is how much weight is given to staff when they bring a recommendation, because they are seen as giving that information to elected leaders to allow elected leaders to make the decision. And I'm just curious, in both of your experience, do you feel that sometimes staff can weight the evidence in a certain way or massage the evidence in a certain way to lead to an ideologically predisposed outcome? And if that is the case, what sources of information do you go to in order to combat that? And I think that would be a very practical thing. For
It is, and it's hard for me to overstate how much abuse the city bureaucrats get away with doctoring and cooking the books and manipulating the information. It's impossible for me to overstate the power that city bureaucracies get out of picking the consultants. They handpick the consultants, they handpick the economists, they handpick everybody that's going to say only what they say. Because you think about it, the bureaucrats are handing the check to the consultant. So where is the loyalty going to be for the consultant? So these consultants are simply doing what they've been paid to do, and that's to toe whatever line the bureaucrats want to give them. Let me give you one quick example, and this is really, really important. And it shows you the incredible arrogance of the city staff. You know, we have a divided Austin City Council, obviously, and we have these boards and commissions, okay? You've heard of these boards and commissions. Well, the boards and commissions are even a worse abuse of bureaucrats' power, because what they do with the boards and commissions is they bring them in and they give them hand-picked information that's really propaganda that leads them to decide only in one direction how they should vote. And so the boards and commissions are just rubber stamps for what the bureaucrats want to do. And then the bureaucrats use the boards and commissions' votes to go to the council and say, well, the boards and commissions already voted this way, which is the bureaucrats' agenda, so you need to do it too. But let me tell you one of the rare cases where this backfired on them, and it was on a case of the Republic Waste facility. And some of you have been in Austin a long time, and you know the controversy behind one of these landfills, Republic Waste landfill. And I think it dates back decades, but there are a bunch of environmental violations by this particular landfill, and it was decided a long time ago that the landfill would not be expanded, okay? So guess what happens about a year or so ago, a year and a half ago, the city bureaucrats are suddenly on this political campaign to expand the Republic Waste site that was supposed to be closed down. Now this raised the ire of the environmentalists. So you got one of these rare cases where fiscal conservatives, environmental, everybody's on the same page. And the boards and commissions unanimously voted down the city bureaucrats' demand to open up this landfill and expand it. Astonishing defeat for the bureaucrats. They almost never get defeated. So you know what the bureaucrats do? They come into a work session for the city council to explain away why it was that the commission voted against them. In fact, they didn't even mention that the commission voted against them. They were just talking about this agenda item, expanding the landfill, and they had their consultants, et cetera, and all their data and information. All the books were cooked, ready to move forward. And so I asked the bureaucrat there, the lead bureaucrat, when he got done with his propaganda session, I said, now, can you explain to me why the commission voted unanimously against the proposal that you're still bringing to council? Why did they vote against it unanimously? And here was his answer. He said, well, council member, we'll have consultants there to answer any objections that could come up. I said, did you hear my question? The question was, what about the position of the people who voted unanimously against it? Is their position going to be represented by consultants or in any fashion? And he had the deer in the headlight looks. Just frozen. Like, you mean we as staff presenting information that disagrees with what we want to do? We never do that. It's just a silent admission. The deer in the headlights. Like, unbelievable. All right, it gets better. So there's this big packet of information that the commission used when they voted against it. It came from Texas Disposal Systems. A good friend of TPPF, Mr. Gregory, and a great bunch of research. It's Austin Chronicle articles, left-wing articles, right? It's information out in the public domain. So the city bureaucrats, when they prepare the agenda, they control the agenda information. There was no information in opposition to what the bureaucrats wanted to do. So I sent it to them and I said, please attach this public documentation, public information, please attach this to the agenda item so it becomes part of the record and the council members have this information. It's just factual information. It disagrees with the bureaucrats, but it's out in the public domain. They refused. They refused to attach this public information to the agenda item. Now that, another illustration of the incredible abuse of government bureaucrats. But there's 13,000 of them. A lot of Austin bureaucrats, right? I can't keep up with all the bad behavior of this culture of abuse of power. So just another little interesting story and a data point for what's going on. But again, I've run over my time. I apologize. I'm just full of stories like this.
We're actually living through that right now in Waco. In '92, when I was in junior high, the city settled with a number of citizens out on the west end of town to a lawsuit over permitting and expanding the dump. Back then, they'd bought the city of Woodways, a small bedroom communities dump that was operating on about 40 acres out of 200, and they'd, with TCEQ's predecessor, filed to expand it to 200. That was fought at the whatever the Environmental Commission's name was back then, and then a lawsuit was filed, and they settled with those people. The only benefit that the people that settled got was, you're not going to expand this dump. Well, then they buy 290 acres immediately adjacent to it, and the only purpose originally, they said, was for a buffer, for an environmental zone, and this will eventually be a big park. And without having any the first public hearing is this coming Tuesday night, October 10th. They did send some city staff, because I think the pitchforks and torches were coming out this past summer, out to a meeting in that area. But I mean, realtors, land developers, property developers relied on this settlement. And this is the hottest section of real estate in McLennan County. It's the biggest, most expensive corridor for housing. And this is where we're going to put our next 50 years worth of trash. And the arguments are, it's inevitable. We're going to run out of dump space. We have to do it because we've already started it. That kind of thing. And this is what staff recommends. And that's a trend that you see in local government is we've already got it going. You're upsetting the apple cart. And basically, you're going to end up frustrating it and making it just cost more for everybody else. And why are you complaining? Yeah.
That's interesting. Just moving a little bit to a different topic. The foundation during this last special session was at the forefront of supporting the passage of major annexation reform, which prohibits large cities from annexing without obtaining consent in some fashion from those to be annexed. Previously, as many of you know, and as is still the case for many of the smaller Texas cities, Texas counties, cities could forcibly annex without obtaining consent, as Don had mentioned. Now that this important bill is passed, obviously that's changed for the major cities, but that only happened in the summer of 2017. And one of the things that I thought was interesting looking into Don's background is he provides a great example of why it's so important to have local leaders in the trenches who are advocating for people's liberties and people's property rights at the time. Because we got a reform passed, but it was in August of 2017. And there was a big annexation push that you talked about a little bit before, and it was the first time in history the city voted against an annexation recommendation by city staff. And so I just wanted to pick your brain a little bit more on that. How did you make your case to your colleagues in a way that did not alienate them for life? Or is that even possible? I've read that you've maintained fairly good relationships with the mayor, with your fellow councilors. So how were you able to shift their perspective on that?
Well, I just got the constituents to make all the presentations, and I sat there quietly as if I had nothing to do with it.
So it was like the public involvement.
Yeah, it was public involvement, yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, and we were fortunate to have a wedge issue in that case, which was the flooding. Do you remember the flooding we had in Onion Creek? Some lives were lost, and that was in the news. And the council voted, I believe it was like $60 million to buy out, flood properties that had come in the flood zone. So yeah, we just focused on the issue, and I kind of trained the constituents to make all the cases and to bring the videos. They showed the videos of rising water. Very interesting. So. I have to give the credit to our constituents on that one. But you're right.
Yeah.
If I hadn't had that position, there's no way they would have had a chance.
Okay. So I think we have about 3 minutes before we're going to move to the Q&A. So I just wanted to go down the line again and ask for any parting thoughts that you guys have. What do you see that's on the horizon for local government that you'd like to talk about? And what parting advice do you have for the good folks here?
With me? Well, first off, I've already kind of touched on it. I think we need to get some more information out on reform for the municipal courts. And I think there's ways to work that out as far as keeping the power to have the ability to put people in jail, but use it sparingly. And I think there's ways to do that. Second issue, although the SB 6 passed, it's great, and it's a great start, there's another underlying issue that's going on that no one really knows about. Every time you go up to the legislature, they always get TML again to talk before the committees, and they always say, well, people are protected. We have this SB 89. We have to offer rural landowners development agreements, and we can't annex them for an X amount of years. So they're protected. They're not going to be in the city limits. Well, what cities are doing, and there's one right now in Seguin, they're taking these development agreements and they're daisy chaining them and actually annexing land beyond their ETJ, which you cannot do. So you have cities with ETJ expanding miles and miles past the buffer zones, which is limited by the law. And I have 1 minute and I'll wrap it up. But basically, there's only one way to extend your city boundaries. That's by annexation, period. So what cities are doing is they're using development agreements to expand the ETJ way past areas to go grab land in the future beyond what they can do. So it's a big problem, and I think that needs to be addressed coming up in the future as well.
Doug?
Thanks. So I'd like to quickly recognize Lago Vista Council Member Ed Tidwell. Ed, thanks for being with us. Appreciate you being here. Ed ran for office and won. He's now running for mayor of Lago Vista. So my advice, good. And by the way, I'm going to be supporting Ed Tidwell for mayor of Lago Vista. I'm now a property owner in the city of Lago Vista. But getting involved in local politics, run for a small office. Municipal utility district is another great local office, local school board. If you've got the inclination, run for an office. If you don't, contribute to some cause, make yourself visible. That's how you'll have influence in local governance.
John?
Sure. Yeah, and I think a lot of people get frustrated with their tax bills on the local governments because most of it comes once a year on your property. The state version of taxation is mostly sales tax related and other forms that are passively collected throughout the year. You don't get a giant bill from the state. And so you look at your local governments and you see you're spending $4,000, $5,000, $10,000 in property taxes just to keep your home. And but people don't have that same motivation to actually get involved. School boards are extremely important. They spend a lot of money and they make a lot of policy decisions for your kids' education. You know, a lot of these bathroom debates that we've had, which you can argue how important that is, if you had good, well-reasoned people that had a conservative background, it might be a different debate being going on in the school districts. Your city council spends a ton of money. Your county government has the potential to spend a ton of money. They're usually the bottom of those three local governments as far as spending per property owner. But there is potential if you don't have good eggs in there to grow government and, you know, grow your appraisals, grow your rates at an expansive rate. And on the annexation thing in McLennan County, Waco's ETJ covers almost everything that isn't incorporated. So the little city of Crawford out in the corner and Bruceville Eddy, they don't have very far that they could expand before they hit the ETJ for Waco.
All right, well, we're going to open it up to questions, and I believe this gentleman here had a question first. Please wait for the mic. We got a microphone coming.
Councilman Zimmerman, congratulations for being a conservative in Travis County.
Thanks.
Our
Condolences, you mean,
Yes,
right?
that's true. That is true. I want to just emphasize that I'm in the commercial real estate business, and since Austin is not unusual for passing possibly unconstitutional ordinances, i.e. short-term rentals, you should have probably passed an ordinance while you were there to prevent people in the planning and zoning department in Austin from getting a job within 200 miles of Austin, because now they're going to suburban cities like Leander and Round Rock and bringing that cancerous environment out that way. We have definite overreaching, and unless people get involved in local governments, and don't hire anybody from planning and zoning in Lago Vista, you're going to continue to have this problem. I'm going to give one example and I'll wrap it up. Just north of Leander, unincorporated area, that a gentleman purchased the property. He built a number of light industrial buildings on the property. Of course, there was no zoning prior and anything like that, all in compliance with county rules and whatnot. He was annexed by the city of Leander in April of 2016, and they told him he was annexed as a residential property and therefore could not develop the rest of his acreage, even though he already had plans set in place to do it. Today, as of today, they are still and will not respond in writing to this owner to expand his property on a slab that was already poured to build another building. So when he tries to get a response and say, now you told me in our meeting we cannot do this, please confirm that in writing, they will not respond. So it results in a lawsuit, and there is a lawsuit pending there. The problem is it costs the taxpayers and the citizens, and by the way, the mayor of that city was opposed to the annexation thing of voters having the right to choose there. So don't vote for him when he's running for something either. Thank you.
Okay, well, let me add something quickly to that. You're spot on, and I've been behind those closed doors in their so-called executive session, and I tell you, my hair almost caught on fire a number of times with just listening to these lawyers indoctrinate elected council members behind closed doors, advising them to violate the law. It is outrageous what's going on, and they're using our tax money to fight frivolous lawsuits. They've had frivolous lawsuits being waged, and then they appeal. It's really out of control. We've got to elect more people to stop this abuse and bureaucracies.
All right, let's do the next question. I got a gentleman here in purple. One sec, sir. Just wait for the mic.
Our founding fathers were amazing in what they accomplished, setting up our Constitution, et cetera. And they seemed to understand that then in the future, we're going to have to put human beings in office, not angels. And but I think, and they did some wonderful things, you know, the separation of powers, et cetera, that they had the foresight to do. But one thing I don't think they had any idea what was going to happen is bureaucracy. Mm-hmm. And its numbers and its power. And having worked in all levels of government, from local to international, through international, the thing that just keeps coming to me experiencing with those experiences is decentralization. You can do more damage when you're an international government bureaucrat than a national government, and et cetera, down the line. We need to decentralize power, which our founders, I don't think, recognized such a huge problem.
Mm-hmm. And I'll touch real quick what you said earlier on that annexation deal. You said you had the people come, you know, and that's what's important. We need to educate, just what you're saying. Absolutely. Get more people involved, which is one good reason why we're here today. There's not many organizations.
Can I add something? I can just add something incognito. If I can, let's see. I will admit that on that localization idea of bureaucrats, pitting bureaucrats against each other, it's a beautiful thing. That can be done and it's effective, yeah. But you're right. If you have one international bureaucrat, you have a huge problem. But city bureaucrats or city, county, and school, to watch those guys fighting over their power, it's a beautiful thing.
Well, and being right doesn't mean that you're going to win, and you're paying for their lawyers and yours. And you know, another thing is just because it's a good common sense idea doesn't mean they're going to listen to you. That kind of the ensconced, I've already got my mind made up, and we've already got these plans going. The dump I was talking about earlier is the bottom of the leachate is about less than 20 yards above the floodplain for our lake, which is our drinking water. How smart is that? So.
Let's see, a question over here. You guys are in my blind spot, so.
Yeah, I was hoping somebody up there could answer a question that's been bothering me. How does the Texas State Constitution limit the power of city governments? It seems to me that they're trying to provide services that, from everything from bubblegum machines to affordable housing. Isn't there any kind of limit that the state puts on what services they can provide?
Real quick, the only constitutional state is separation of powers, which you mentioned before. You know, you have your council is the legislative branch, you have your city manager as the executive, and then you have the judicial branch. But as far as limiting powers, that's up to the state legislature. So it's all state legislature driven.
I was asking, does the Texas Constitution limit this?
You get into a home rule situation, and the way I've always understood it is a city can do anything that it's not barred from doing. A county, on the other hand, has to be given the permission to do it. So I can't just go out there and start offering new government services as a county elected official, but a city can decide we want to have a city-owned affordable housing complex or something along those lines that the do-gooders want to provide at our expense, and it sounds good and they want to spend our money, and unless there's a state law that prevents it, they're allowed to do it.
That's correct, that's home rule cities. So the smaller cities, though, like type A, B, and C, they can only do what the legislature allows them to do. So you can limit home rule, in other words, they can do whatever they want, but type A, B, and C, you can have to look to the state, right?
And just to add one more comment on that, there may be discrete protections to the people in the Texas Constitution that you can sue a city for passing an ordinance that you say violates that provision, right? And so, for example, the foundation is engaged in a lawsuit against the city of Austin for its short-term rental ordinance, stating that that's a violation of people's private property rights. So a question to the gentleman in the back in the beige jacket.
My comments and question is how do we get the legislature to go fix some of these problems? Example, I had a collision with Georgetown several years back on the Lone Star Rail, and they were going to implement a transportation reinvestment zone that I'd fought that legislation as well with a resolution. And after the council meeting, I dragged the mayor aside and I said, you can't do that. The law specifically says it's got to be an ordinance with public hearings. So they did replace their lawyer, but I think the one they got is not much better. City of Richardson, I fought on a red light issue, not the fact that they were using them, but the fact that they were unsafe because they were setting the timing sequences too low to generate revenue instead of safety. And the judge in the courtroom and the traffic manager didn't show up for the case, said almost these exact same words: the city of Richardson can do whatever they want. So how do we get the legislature to go put these boundaries on this behavior? Because even when citizens like myself, our only recourse is to take our own personal money to hire a lawyer to try and get something done. The state should provide some resource for putting checks and balances in.
Can I try that? Well, it's a great point. I think the Texas Attorney General's office should really have a task force to handle these kinds of abuses of power so that private property owners aren't stuck with the legal bill, which easily runs into the hundreds of thousands of dollars to try to enforce your property rights. You'll hear cities talk about local control. Oh, the state is infringing on our local control. We didn't put you in office for local control. We put you there for local liberty. I ran for office to defend local liberty, not to impose local control. Their whole mindset, as you know, is corrupt and backwards. They're looking to exercise power and control constantly. But I think the short answer is the Texas Attorney General's office ought to have a task force that goes after cities for egregious violations of the law. They violate Chapter 254 of the Texas Code for Property Rights. So this is the thing. Remember, we had abuses by cities of property rights, so we put in Chapter 254. So what do? They reinterpret what the law says to what it doesn't say and start abusing the law again. We're in a vicious circle here, and the legislature has done what they need to do. We need to prosecute the bureaucrats that violate the laws. That's really what needs to happen.
I think we got time for maybe 2 more questions. I haven't gotten to this side here, so the gentleman in the green shirt.
While they get the mic over, sometimes the only thing that your local politicians will understand is that you have more friends than they do. We've seen in Waco where, back on that silly dump issue, the page for Facebook for that group has more affiliations with it than any mayor has gotten in the last 20 years for votes. And the council started paying attention. So,
my question is primarily for Councilman Zimmerman. I noticed earlier this year, Mayor Adler, or the City of Austin released a report on institutional racism and systemic inequities, and it's a 71-page report, roughly, that has numerous 10-point plans, and I think there's even now a new diversity person involved. And I couldn't help but notice there were 47 members on the task force, and it's like, I don't know that there's one member who didn't think that the fact that, Austin, 10% of the doctors, lawyers, software engineers, et cetera, aren't African American and 35% aren't Hispanic, that's a problem that results from white racism that can't be explained by some other, other means. And so it occurred to me also in reading the report, which is available online, anybody can see it. It's a huge 71-page report, but it's almost as if you didn't agree with the idea that Austin is an institutionally racist city, that you wouldn't have been appointed. I mean, does that comport with most of your experience?
It is. The racism as a political tool is abused beyond the belief. I've read most of that 71 pages. It's hard to stomach it because it's such subjective gobbledygook, and it's laced with racism on its own. If that plan, the mayor's plan, it would be challenged in court because it's racist. It's a plan to discriminate on the basis of ethnicity. That's what the cure for a non-existent problem is to implement and institutionalize racism officially. It is just the backwards thinking of progressive. It's crazy. I'm sorry, it's crazy. I don't know what else to say about it, but if they try to implement it, it will be challenged in court and they'll lose. But they just want to stir up more trouble, stir up more racial division, and so they can point the finger and falsely accuse people of being racist. It's one of the uglier parts of politics. And let me say something about Mayor Adler. He is a very brilliant lawyer, very, very intelligent, one of the smartest people I've known. He knows better. It's political ideology. That kind of junk is nothing but progressive political ideology. And he's married to that political ideology same way I'm married to the Constitution and our Christian libertarianism. I'm married to my ideology. He's married to his. So it really is, that thing's an ideological battle, and it's got to be killed.
We have time for one more question. Gentleman in the middle.
I'd be interested in your opinions with regards to when local governments use taxpayer funds to lobby Austin against the wishes of their own taxpayers. I'm talking about school districts, maybe arguing against school choice.
Again,
like that.
it has been banned by the legislature numerous times, okay? So they have a simple solution. When you ban lobbying with the taxpayers' money against our interest, they just relabel it education and keep spending your money. Okay. Well, that's a great question, though, and it's got to be attacked.
So let's all give a hand to our great panel. We're about out of time. Thank you, Joe. At this time, I'm going to request that you all make your way to the elevators, but before you go, just a little bit of information. You're going to be heading to the 6th floor for lunch. and to hear the keynote from Austin City Councilwoman Ellen Troxclair. When you get there, there are going to be boxes with food labeled on the different tables, turkey or ham. Sit where you want to, what kind of food you want to eat. Makes sense. All right, so thank you guys so much. We'll see you up there.